Professor von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 4. The Phantom Motor Car. Two dazzling white eyes bulged suddenly through the night as a motor car swept round a curve in the wide road and laid a smooth, glaring pathway ahead. Even at the distance, the rhythmical, clacking chug informed Special Constable Baker that it was a gasoline car, and the headlong swoop of the unblinking lights towards him made him instantly aware of the fact that the speed ordinance of Yarborough County was being a little more than broken. It was being obliterated. Now, the county of Yarborough was one wide expanse of summer estates and superbly kept roads, level as a floor, and offered distracting temptations to the dangerous pastime of racing. But against this was the fact that the county was particularly about its speed laws, so particular, in fact, that it had stationed 100 men on its highways to abate the nuisance. Incidentally, it had found that keeping record of infractions of the law was an excellent source of income. 40 miles an hour of an inch, remarked Baker to himself. He rose from a camp stool where he was wont to make himself comfortable on watch from 6 o'clock until midnight, picked up his lantern, and turned up the light, and stepped out to the edge of the road. He was already remaining on watch at the same place, at one end of a long stretch which motorists had unanimously dubbed the Trap. A macadamized road between two tall wall stones with only a sinuous twist in it to make each end invisible from the center. Another man, Special Constable Bowman, was stationed at the other end of the trap, and there was a telephonic communication between the points, enabling the two to check on each other, and incidentally, if one failed to stop a car or get its number, the other would. At least, that was the theory. So now, with the utmost confidence, Baker waited beside the road. Approaching lights were only a couple of 100 yards away. At the proper instant, he would raise his lantern. The car would stop. Its occupants would protest, and then the county would add a mite to its general fund for making the roads even better and more tempting for motorists. Or sometimes the cars did not stop. In that event, it was part of the Special Constable's duty to get the number as it flew past, and reference to the monthly motor car register gave name of the owner. An extra fine was always imposed in such cases. Without the slightest diminution of speed, the car came hurtling on towards him and swung wide so as to take the straight path of the trap at full speed. At the psychological instant, Baker stepped out onto the road and waved his lantern. "Stop!" he commanded. The crackling chug came on, heedless of the cry. The car was almost on him before he leaped out of the road, a feat at which he was particularly expert. And then it flashed by and plunged into the trap. Baker was, at the instant, so busily engaged in getting out of the way that he could not read the number, but he was not disconcerted because he knew that there was no escape from the trap. On the one side, a solid stone wall 8 feet high marked the eastern boundary of John Phelps Stocker Country Estate. On the other side, a stone fence 9 feet tall marked the western boundary of the Thomas Q. Rogers Country Estate. There was no turnout, no place, no possible way for an auto to get out of the trap, except at one of the two ends guarded by the special constables. So Baker, perfectly confident of the results, seized the phone. Car coming through 60 miles an hour, he bawled. It won't stop. I missed the number. Look out. All right, answered Special Constable Bowman. For 10, 15, 20 minutes, Baker expected a call from the other end. It did not come, and finally he picked up the phone again, and no answer. He rang several times, battered the box, and did some tricks with the receiver. Still, no answer. Finally, he began to feel worried. He remembered that at the same post, one special constable had been badly hurt by a reckless chauffeur who refused to stop or turn his car when the officer stepped out onto the road. In his mind's eye, he saw Bowman now lying helpless, perhaps badly injured. If the car had held the pace at which it had passed him, it would certainly be death for whoever might be unlucky enough to get in its path. With these thoughts running through his head, and with genuine solitude for Bowman, Baker at last walked on the road of the trap toward the other end. The feeble rays of his lantern showed an unbroken line of the cold stone walls on each side. There was no shrubbery of any sort, only a narrow strip of grass close to the road. The more Baker considered the matter, the more anxious he became, and he increased his pace a little. As he turned a gentle curve, he saw the lantern in the distance coming slowly towards him. It was evidently being carried by someone who was looking carefully along each side of the road. "Hello!" called Baker when the lantern came within distance. "Is that you, Bowman?" "Yes," called the other haloed response. The lanterns moved in and met. Baker's solicitude for the other constable had quickly changed to curiosity. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "The motor," replied Bowman. "It didn't come through my end, and I thought perhaps there had been an incident, or so I walked along looking for it. I haven't seen anything." "Didn't come through your end?" repeated Baker with amazement. "Why, it must have. It didn't come back my way, and I haven't passed it, so it must have gone through." "Well, it didn't," declared Bowman conclusively. "I was on the lookout for it, too, standing beside the road. There hasn't been a car through my end in an hour." Special Constable Baker raised his lantern until the rays fell full on the face of Special Constable Bowman, and for an instant they stared at each other. Suspicion glowed from the keen, avaricious eyes of Baker. "How much did they give you to let them by?" he asked. "Give me?" exclaimed Baker in righteous indignation. "Give me? Nothing. I haven't seen a car." A slight sneer curled on the lips of Special Constable Baker. "Of course, that's all right to report at headquarters," he said. "But I happen to know that the motor came in here, that it couldn't come back any of my way, that it couldn't get out except at the ends. Therefore, it went your way." He was silent for a moment. "And whatever you got, Jim, seems to me I ought to get half." Then the worm, i.e. Bowman, turned. A polite curl appeared around his lips and was permitted to show through the grimaced mustache. "I guess," he said deliberately, "you think because you do that, everybody else does. I haven't seen any motors." "Don't I always give you half, Jim?" Baker demanded, almost pleadingly. "Well, I haven't seen any car, and that's all there is of it. If it didn't go back your way, there wasn't any car." There was a pause. Bowman was framing up something particularly unpleasant. "You're seeing things. That's the matter with you." So it was discord between two officers of the county of Yarborough. After a while, they separated with mutual sneers and derision, and went back to their respective posts. Each was thoughtful in his own way. At 5 minutes to midnight, just before the off-duty went, Baker called Bowman on the phone again. "I've been thinking the thing over, Jim. I guess it would be just as well as if we didn't report or say anything about it when we go in," said Baker slowly. "It seems foolish if we say anything. about it, and it would give the boys a laugh at us." "Just as you say," responded Bowman. Relations between Constable Baker and Constable Bowman were strained in the morrow, but they walked along side by side to their respective posts. Baker stopped at his end of the trap, and Bowman did not even look around. "You'd better keep your eyes open tonight, Jim," Baker called out at last word. "I had 'em open last night," was the disgusted report. 7, 8 o'clock passed. 2 or 3 cars had gone through the trap at moderate speed, and one had been warned by Baker. At a few minutes past 9, he was staring down the road which led into the trap when he saw something that brought him quickly to his feet. It was a pair of dazzling white eyes far away. He recognized them, the mysterious car from the night before. "I'll get her this time," he muttered grimly between closed teeth. Then, when the onrushing car was full 200 yards away, Baker planted himself in the middle of the road and began to swing the lantern. The car seemed, if anything, to be traveling even faster than on the previous night. At 100 yards, Baker began to shout. Still, the car did not lessen speed, merely rushed on. Again, at the psychological instant, Baker jumped. The car whisked by as the chauffeur gave a dexterous twist to prevent running down the Special Constable. Safely out of its way, Baker turned and stared after it, trying to read the number. He could see there was a number because the whiteboard swung on the tail axle, but he could not make out the figures. Dust in a swaying car conspired to defeat him. And he did see, too, that there were 4 persons in the car dimly silhouetted against the light reflected from the road. It was useless, of course, to conjecture as to the sex, for even he looked as fast receding car swerved around the turn and was lost to sight. Again, he rushed to the telephone. Bowman responded promptly. "The car's gone in again," Baker called. 90 miles an hour. Look out." "I'm looking," responded Bowman. "Let me know what happens," Baker shouted. With the receiver at his ear, he stood for 10 or 15 minutes. Then Bowman helloed from the other end. "Well," Baker responded, "get 'em?" "No car passed through, and there's none in sight," said Bowman. "But it went in," insisted Baker. "Well, it didn't come out here," declared Bowman. "Walk along the road till I meet you, and look out for it." Then was repeated the search of the night before. When the 2 men met in the middle of the trap, their faces were blank. Blank as the high stone walls which stared at them from either side. "Nothing," replied Baker. "Nothing," echoed Baker. Special Constable Bowman perched his head on one side and scratched his grizzly chin. "You're not trying to put up a job on me, are you?" he inquired coldly. "You did see a car." "I certainly did," declared Baker, and a belligerent tone underlay his manner. "I certainly saw it, Jim, and if it didn't come your way to the end, why... He paused, and then glanced quickly beside him. The action inspired a suddenly similar one from Bowman's part. "Maybe," said Bowman after a minute, "maybe it's a spook car?" "Well, it must be," mused Baker. "You know as well as I do that no car can get out of this trap except for the ends. The car came in here, it didn't come out there. Now where is it?" Bowman stared at him in a moment, and picked up his lantern and shook his head solemnly and wandered back the road to his post. On his way, he glanced around quickly, apprehensively. 3 times. Baker did the same 4 times. On the 3rd night, the phantom car appeared and disappeared precisely as it had done previously. Again, Baker and Bowman met halfway between the posts and talked it over. "I'll tell you what, Baker," said Bowman in conclusion. "Maybe you're just imagining that you see the car. Maybe it was at your end I couldn't see it." Special Constable Baker was distinctly hurt at the indignation. "All right, Jim," he said at last. If you think that way about it, we'll swap posts tomorrow night. We won't have to say anything about it until we report." "Now that's the talk," exclaimed Bowman with an air of approaching enthusiasm. "I bet I won't see it." On the following night, Special Constable Bowman made himself comfortable on Special Constable Baker's camp stool, and he saw the phantom car. It came upon him with a rush and a cracking chug of the engine, then sped on, leaving him nerveless. He called Baker over the wire, and Wire watched half an hour for the phantom. It did not appear. Ultimately, all things reached the newspapers, so the story of the phantom motor car, Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, smiled incredulously when his city editor laid aside the inevitable cigar and tersely stated the known facts. The known facts in this instance were meager, almost to a disappearing point. They consisted merely of a corroborated statement that the motor car, solid and tangible enough to all appearances, had rushed into the trap each night and totally disappeared. But there was enough of a bizarre about it to pique the curiosity, to make one wonder. So Hatch journeyed down to Yarborough Country, on an hour's ride from the city, and met and talked to Baker and Bowman, and then, in broad daylight, strolled along the trap twice. It was a leisurely, thorough investigation with the end in view of finding out how the automobile, once inside, might get out again without going out the other end. On the first trip through, Hatch paid particular attention to the Thomas Q. Rogers side of the road. The wall, 9 feet high, was an unbroken line of stone, with not the slightest indication of a secret way through it anywhere. Secret way. Hatch smiled at the phrase, but when he reached the other end, Bowman's end of the trap, he was perfectly convinced of one thing, that no motor car had left the hard, macadamized road to go over, under, or through the Thomas Q. Rogers wall. Returning still leisurely, he paid strict attention to the John Phelps stalker side, and when he reached the other end, Baker's end, he was convinced of another thing, that no motor car had left the road to go over, under, or through the John Phelps stalker side. Hatch saw no shrubbery along the road, nothing but a strip of scrupulously cared-for grass. Therefore the phantom car could not be hidden at any time, day or night. Hatch failed, too, to find any holes in the road, so the car did not go down to the earth. At this point, he involuntarily glanced up at the blue sky. Perhaps, he thought whimsically, the automobile was a strange sort of bird, or... And he stopped suddenly. "By George!" he exclaimed. "I wonder if—" On the remainder of the afternoon he spent systematically making inquiries. He went from house to house, the Stalker house, the Rogers house, both of which at the time were unoccupied, then the cottage, a cabin, a hut in the turn, but he did not seem overladen with information when he joined Special Constable Baker at the end of the trap that evening about 7 o'clock. Together they rehearsed the strange points of the mystery as the shadows grew around them, until finally the darkness was so dense that Baker's lantern was the only bright spot of sight. As the chill of evening closed in, a certain odd tone crept into their voices. Occasionally a motor car bowled along, and each time as it hove in sight, Hatch glanced at Baker questioningly, and each time Baker shook his head. At each time, too, he called Bowman in this manner, accounting for every car that went into the trap. "It'll come along all right," said Baker after a long silence, "and I know it'll be a minute and rounds a curve towards us, and it'll be 2 headlights in 1,000. They sat still and smoked. After a while, and 2 dazzling white lights burst into view down the road, and Baker, with excitement, dropped his pipe. "That's her," he declared. "Look at her coming!" And Hatch did look at her coming. The speed of the mysterious car was such to make one look, like eyes of a giant, and 2 lights came toward them, and Baker perfunctorily went to the motions of attempting to stop it. The car fairly whizzed past them, and the rush of air which tugged at their coats was convincing enough that it was solid. Hatch strained his eyes to read the number of the motor as flashed by, but it was hopeless. The tail of the car was lost in an eddying whirl of dust. "She certainly does travel," commented Baker softly. "She does," Hatch assented. Then, for the benefit of the newspaperman, Baker called Bowman on the wire. "Car's coming again," he shouted. "Look out and let me know." Bowman, at his end, waited 20 minutes, then made the usual report. The car had not passed. Hutchinson Hatch was a calm, cold, dispassionate young man, but now a queer, creepy sensation stole along his spinal column. He lighted a cigarette and pulled himself together with a jerk. "There's one way to find out where it goes," he declared last emphatically, "and that's to place a man in the middle just beyond the bend of the trap and let him wait to see. If the car goes up, down, or even evaporates, he'll see and can tell us." Baker looked at him curiously. "I'd hate to be the man in the middle," he declared. There was something of uneasiness in his manner. "I think I would too," responded Hatch. On the following evening, consequent of the appearance of the story in the Phantom Motor in Hatch's paper, there were 12 other reporters on hand. Most of them were openly, flagrantly skeptical. They even insinuated that no one had seen the car. Hatch smiled wisely. "Wait," he advised with deep conviction. So when the darkness fell that evening, the newspaper men of the great city had entered into a conspiracy to capture the phantom car. 13 of them, making a total of 15 men with Baker and Bowman, were on hand, and they agreed to a suggestion for all to take positions along the road of the trap from Baker's post to Bowman's, watch for the car and so see what happened, and compare notes afterwards. So they scattered themselves along a few hundred feet apart and waited. That night the Phantom did not appear at all, and the 12 reporters jeered at Hutchinson Hatch and told him to light his pipe with the story. The next night, when Hatch and Baker and Bowman alone were watching, the Phantom Motor reappeared. Whereupon, like a child with a trouble problem, Hatch took the entire matter and laid it before Professor von Dusen, the master brain which had, at various times, untangled facts from a score of more intricate matters for his benefit. The thinking machine, with squint eyes turned steadily upward and long, slender fingers pressed tip to tip, listened to the story. "Motor cars can't fly," Hatch burst out savagely in conclusion. "And if this one doesn't fly, there's no earthly way for it to get out of the trap, as they call it. I went over the thing carefully. I even went so far as to examine the ground and the tops of the walls to see if a runway had been let down for the auto to go over." The thinking machine squinted at him inquiringly. "Are you sure you saw a motor car?" he demanded irritably. "Certainly I saw it," blurted out the reporter. "I not only saw it, I smelt it. And just to convince myself it was real, I tossed my cane in front of the thing and it smashed it to toothpicks." "Perhaps then, if everything has, as you say, the car actually has wings," remarked the scientist. The reporter stared into the calm, inscrutable face of the thinking machine, fearing first that he might not have heard right. Then he concluded that he had. "You mean," he inquired eagerly, "that the Phantom may be a motor aeroplane?" "It's not at all impossible," commented the scientist. "I had an idea of something like that myself," Hatch explained, "and questioned every soul within a mile or so, but I didn't get anything." "The perfect stretch of road there might be very place at some daring experiments to get up sufficient speed to soar a short distance in the light machine," continued the scientist. "Light machine," Hatch repeated. "Didn't I tell you that the car had 4 people in it?" "4 people!" exclaimed the scientist. Dear me, that does make a difference. Of course 4 people would be too great to lift up for it. For 10 minutes he sat silent. The tiny cobweb lines appeared his dome-like brow. Then he rose and passed into the adjoining room. After a moment, Hatch heard the telephone bell jingle. 5 minutes later, the thinking machine appeared and scowled upon him unpleasantly. I suppose what you really want to say is that if the car is a material thing, and to whom it belongs, he queried. Oh, that's it, queried the reporter. And of course, why does it do what it does, and how it gets out of the trap? Do you happen to know a fast, long-distance bicycle rider? Demanded the scientist abruptly. 12 of them, replied the reporter promptly. I think I see the idea, but... You haven't the faintest inkling of an idea, declared the thinking machine positively. If you can arrange with a fast rider who can go the distance, it might be 30, 40, 50 miles, we may end up a little fair without difficulty. In these circumstances, Professor von Dusen, scientist and logician, met the famous Jimmy Thulhauer, the world's champion long-distance bicyclist. He held every record from 5 miles up to including 6 hours, had won twice the 6-day race, and was, altogether, a master in his field. He came in chewing a toothpick. There were introductions. You ride the bicycle? Inquired the crusty little scientist. Oh, some, confessed the champion modestly with a wink at Hatch. Can you keep up with a motor car for a distance of, say, 30 or 40 miles? I can keep up with anything that ain't got wings, was the response. Well, to tell you the truth, volunteered Professor von Dusen, there is a growing belief that this particular car has wings. However, if you can keep up with it... Quit, you're kidding, said the champion, easily. I can ride rings around anything on wheels. I'll start behind it and beat it to where it's going. Professor von Dusen examined the champion, Jimmy Thulhauer, with a curiosity. In the seclusion of his laboratory, he had never had the opportunity of meeting such another worldly young person. How fast can you ride, Mr. Thulhauer? He asked at last. I'm ashamed to tell you, confided the champion in a hushed voice. I can ride so fast that I scare myself. He paused for a moment. But it seems to me, he said, if there's 30 or 40 miles to do, I ought to do it on a motorcycle. Now that's just the point, exclaimed Professor von Dusen. A motorcycle will make noise, and if anything of that sort could be used, we should have hired a fast motorcycle. The proposition briefly is, I want you to ride without lights behind a motor car, which may also run without lights, and find out where it goes. No occupant of the vehicle must know that they're being followed. Without lights, repeated the champion. Gee, rubber shoe, eh? The thinking machine looked in his bewilderment. Yes, that's it, Hatch answered for him. I guess it's good for a 4-column head, inquired the champion. Special pictures posted for the champion, eh? Yes, Hatch replied. Tracked on a bicycle sounds good to me, eh? Hatch nodded. So arrangements were concluded, and then and there Professor von Dusen gave definite and conclusive instructions to the champion. While these apparently bore broadly on the problem in hand, they conveyed absolutely no inkling of his plan to the reporter. At the end, the champion arose to go. You're a most extraordinary young man, Mr. Thulhauer, commented the scientist, not without admiration for the sturdy, powerful figure. And as Hatch accompanied the champion out of the room and down the steps, Jimmy smiled with an easy grace. Nutty old guy, ain't he? Night. Utter blackness, relieved only by a white ribbon-like road which winds its way mistily under a starless sky. Shadowy hedges lined either side, and occasionally a tree thrust itself upward out of the somberness. A murmur of human voices in the shadows, and the crackling chug of an engine with the motor car moves slowly without lights onto the road. There's a sudden clatter of an engine at high speed, and the car rushes away. From the hedge comes a faint rustle of leaves in the wind, stirring when a figure moves impalpably. The movement and it becomes a separate entity, a quick movement and the creak of a leather bicycle saddle. Silently, a single figure, bent low over the handlebars, moves after the car with an ever-increasing momentum. Then a long, desperate race. For mile after mile, the car goes on. The silent cyclist has crept up almost on the rear axle and hangs there doggedly as a racer to his pacer. On and on they rushed together toward the darkness, the chauffeur moving with a perfect knowledge of his road, the single rider behind clinging on grimly with set teeth. The powerful piston-like legs move up and down to the beat of the engine. At last, with a dust-dry throat and stinging, aching eyes, the cyclist feels the pace slacken, and instantly he drops back out of sight. It is only by sound that he follows now. The car stops. The cyclist is lost in the shadows. 2 or 3 hours, the car stands deserted and silent. At last the voices are heard again. The car stirs and moves away. The cyclist drops in behind. Another race, which leads off in another direction. Finally, from a knoll, the lights of the city are seen. 10 minutes elapse, and the motor car stops. The headlights flare up, and more leisurely proceeds on its way. On the following evening, Professor von Dusen and Hutchinson Hatch call upon the Fielding Stanwood, president of the Fortis National Bank. Mr. Stanwood looked at them in interrogative eyes. "We call to inform you, Mr. Stanwood," exclaimed the Professor von Dusen, "that a box of securities, probably United States bonds, is missing from your bank." "What?" exclaimed Mr. Stanwood, his face paled. "Robbery?" "I only know the bonds were taken out of the vault tonight by Mr. Joseph Marsh, your assistant cashier," said the scientist, "and that he, together with 3 other men, left the bank with the box and are now at a place I can name." Mr. Stanwood was staring at him in amazement. "You know where they are?" he demanded. "I said I did," replied the scientist shortly. "You must inform the police at once, and—" "I don't know that there has been an actual crime," interrupted the scientist. "I do know that every night for a week these bonds have been taken out, through a conveyance of your watchman, and in each instance have been returned intact before morning. They will be returned tonight, therefore I would advise, if you act, not to do so until the 4 men return with the bonds." It was a singular party which met the private office of President Stanwood at the bank just after midnight. Marsh and 3 companions, formerly under arrest, were present, as were President Stanwood, Professor von Dusen, Hutchinson Hatch, besides detectives. Marsh had the bonds under his arm when he was taken. He talked freely when questioned. "I will admit," he said without hesitation, "that I have acted beyond my rights in removing the bonds from the vault. I am a responsible officer of the bank and have violated no trust. Nothing is missing, nothing is stolen. Every bond that went out of the bank is here." "But why? Why did you take the bonds?" demanded Mr. Stanwood. Marsh shrugged his shoulders. "It's what we called a get-rich-quick scheme," said Professor von Dusen. "Mr. Hatch and I made some investigations today. Mr. Marsh and these others 3 have been interested in a business venture which is ethically dishonest, but which is within the law. They have sought backing for the scheme amounting to about $1 million. Those 4 or 5 men of means by whom they have discussed the matter have called each other each night of the week in Martian's country place. It was necessary to make them believe that there was already $1 million or so in the scheme, so these bonds were borrowed and represented to the owned by themselves. They were taken to and fro between the bank to his home in a kind of motor car. This is really what happened based on the knowledge which Mr. Hatch has gathered, and what I myself developed by use of a little logic." And his statement of the affair proved to be correct. Marsh and the others admitted it. It was while Professor Von Dusen was homeward bound that he explained the Phantom Car affair to Hatch. "The Phantom Car, as you call it," he said, "is a vehicle in which the bonds were moved about. The Phantom idea came merely by chance. On the night the vehicle was first noticed, it was rushing along, we will say, to reach Marsh's house in time for an appointment. A road map will show you that the most direct line from the bank to Marsh's is through the trap. If an automobile should go halfway through there and cut across the Stockler estate to the other road, and the distance would have lessened by 5 miles. The salvaging at first, of course, valuable to the car that had rushed into the trap, was merely to take it across the Stockler estate to the front road. Of course, they always returned to the bank by another route." "But how?" demanded Hatch. "There's no road there." "I learned by phone that Mr. Stocker, there's a narrow walk from a very narrow gate to Stocker's wall to the trap leading through the grounds and another road. The Phantom Car wasn't really a motor at all. It was merely 2 motorcycles arranged seating and a steering apparatus. The French army has been experimenting with them. The motor car cycles are, of course, separate machines. And as such, they were easy to trundle them through the narrow gate and across to the other side. The seats are light, and they can be carried under the arm. I knew instantly that the Phantom must be when I knew that there was no road to only a gateway." "Oh," exclaimed Hatch suddenly. Then, after a minute, "But what did Jimmy Thowler have to do?" "He waited on the road to the other path of the side, the opposite end of the trap," the scientist explained. "When the auto was brought through, put together, he followed it to the Marsh's home and there to the bank. The rest of it you and I worked out today. It's merely logic, Mr. Hatch. Logic." There was a pause. "That Mr. Thowler is really a marvelous young man, Mr. Hatch. Don't you